Hello chaps and chapesses. This week we're going to talk about which rod for which job. I was on the phone to a client this week who asked me about buying fly rods. Which rod should I get for this? Should I get a 6-weight to go to Iceland? Should I get a 4-weight for the chalk streams? And they were a bit confused about the line weight system. So I'm going to try and break this down into a very simple way. Firstly, what is the line system? What are the line classes? And secondly, these days, because it has changed a little, which rods should you have for which jobs? So back in about the late 1950s, the American Fishing Tackle Manufacturers Association, say that really fast,
the American Fishing Tackle Manufacturers Association,
decided that it would be a good idea to try and standardize line classes for rods so that actually we would know whether a rod should be used for a particular reason or a particular instance. And also in those days it was very difficult to match fly lines with rods because all manufacturers were essentially doing their own thing. There was no form of standardization. So you could go and buy yourself a line from one manufacturer which was supposed to suit a certain class of rod, put it on a rod from another manufacturer, and you would have a thing which behaved a bit like a dog. You had absolutely no idea. So they tried to standardize a system which up to now we've been using quite happily. Now this is the AFTMA system, which is what you will see stamped on fly rods and what we refer to as line classes. Now when we start talking about weights of rods, quite often people look at us mystified who are not in the fly fishing community. We say, well, how much does this weigh? No, we're not talking about physical weight. Actually, we're talking about the first 30 feet of a fly line and how much that weighs, because that is where the classification comes from. It's this first 30 feet which is measured in grains, which are also equivalent to grams, as there are 14 grains in a gram. And it is this length of line that manufacturers have used to determine the line class and actions of their fly rods. With modern fibers, modern materials and fly rods, actually this line class system may be slightly out of date and it may be time for a bit of a refresher, which is why actually when it comes to salmon fly rods, quite often they've started using grains, which is more accurate, instead of a particular line class. These line classes are really determined by those people who are building the fly rod. So they'll pick it up and go, wiggle test, put a line on it, that feels like a 5-weight or it feels like a 6-weight. It's not actually a scientific process. So with that all out of the way, essentially we run on a line class system which ranges from 0 up to about 16, with 0 being the lightest class of rod and 16 being the heaviest. So 0 you might be using on small creeks and streams for tiny little wild trout. 16 at the other end of the spectrum, you're trying to horse in a marlin on what is essentially is a boat rod with fly rod fittings. I'm gonna actually break this down to 0 to 2 would be my first category. This is a very light class. It isn't used that much. It's only used by people who are looking for an incredibly small lightweight rod to use in probably overhanging streams for wild fish. There are instances of people using light line classes in the same way that you might go down a bore in a shotgun for shooting to really make it more interesting and more sporting for them. But there has always been this argument of, oh, you shouldn't go down in line classes because that is not applying enough pressure to the fish, therefore you are tiring the fish unnecessarily. I think with modern rod technology, that's probably no longer the case. You can apply an enormous amount of pressure even these days with a 2-weight. The 0 weights, you don't see many of those around. 1 weights, again, you don't really see too many of those around. I think the first line class we begin to see more of are 2 weights. And in this modern era, we're mostly using 9 foot, 9.5, 10 foot 2 weights as nymph rods for European nymphing techniques or French leader techniques. It's that very soft tip that allows you to have the feel to connect you directly to the fish. 3 weight is the first class that I personally begin to use. 3 weight rods, mostly in the 9 foot, 9, 10 foot, again, that kind of length. 3 weights are great fun. They are a brilliant nymphing rod, very small dry fly rod, lovely light presentation, and will land the fly very gingerly on the water surface, which is actually a serious advantage on small streams and for very spooky wild fish. Once we get up to 4 weight is a very good dry fly line weight. So 9 foot 4 weights, 9.5 foot 4 weights, up to 10 foot 4 weights. That is an ideal rod to be using for dry fly fishing on our chalk streams. Traditionally it used to be an 8 foot 6 5 weight, but again, with rod technology moving onwards, you are getting a more powerful rod for a lighter line class. Therefore 4 weight has become a kind of almost a standard dry fly rod. And lengthwise it really depends on which situation you're in, whether you're trying to tuck flies under light bushes or you're trying to get over fronds along the riverbank. I like the 9 foot 9, 10 foot length 4 weights. I find those particularly useful these days. They will still throw a nice big dry fly, mayfly in the mayfly season, but at the same time they have that finesse, and the extra length I have found particularly useful. Once we get to 5 weight is a really good all-round fly rod. If you're going to buy one fly rod for trout fishing, then a 9 foot 5 weight is going to be a really good option for you to start. It's light enough to be able to fish on rivers, but at the same time it's got enough backbone and enough strength to be fishing on small still waters, lochs, and any of that kind of environment. The 9 foot 5 weight really is probably our all-rounder. Once we get up to 6 weights, this is where it begins to get quite interesting, because not only do you have 9 foot 6, 10 foot 6 weights, which are used for trout fishing predominantly, this is also where these rods begin to cross over into salt water. For streamer fishing, for large trout, and also for using big nymphs and trying to cast quite a long way from the bank, the 6 weight, 9 foot 6 weight is a really good tool for this job. It's also the first class that we use for salmon, so a 9 foot 6 weight is a really good rod to use in Iceland. It's perfect for hitching, nice and light presentation, but at the same time there's still an awful lot of backbone in a 6 weight, which will get you out of tricky situations even with a fairly decent sized salmon. 6 weights also, as I said before, the first line class that you begin to think about bonefish. So I've certainly used 9 foot 6 weights in the salt, and it's great fun. They're absolutely ideal for fishing very skinny water for smallish size bonefish. You can drop that fly in with hardly any wake or noise, and playing a fish on a 6 weight is really good fun. But there's still, again, plenty of backbone to use there to really bend the rod into the fish and land it quickly. Once we get into 7 weight territory, the 7 weight used to be the big all-round rod, but actually it's become slightly more specialized these days. So it's still used a lot in stillwater trout fishing, 9 foot 6, 7 weight. It's very, very good for when you start using sunk lines, sink tips, clear intermediates, those kind of things. But the 7 weight is also very good in areas where you're going to be casting heavily into the wind. It does have more backbone than a 6, and it is really useful for punching tight loops into oncoming winds. My personal use of the 7 weight is actually predominantly around bonefish. This is now my go-to bonefish rod. The 9 foot 7 weight is absolutely ideal. It can handle very large fish, it can handle difficult conditions, but at the same time it's still great fun to fish with, and it has got that light presentation that we're seeking, which will allow you to winkle out fish out of slightly tricky situations. Now the 8 weight has become a bit of a quandary to me. I used to use 8 weights a lot in the salt. The 9 foot 8 definitely was the go-to rod for all bone fishing, but I don't really use it anymore. For me, it's almost become a slightly redundant line class. I think where it comes into its own now is in freshwater fishing, and a 9 foot 8 weight or a 9 foot 6 8 weight is an ideal rod for steelhead fishing, If you're going to go and tackle the steelhead and Pacific salmon on the west coast, it's an ideal line class for that. And once you get into the slightly longer two-handed and switch rod variety, the 8-weight really has come into its own in that area. Although actually even switch rods are now built in 7-weight as well. But the 8-weight for me, that's where it fits into my overall international kind of lineup these days. I don't really use it in the salt at all anymore because it's neither one thing or the other. Now the 9-weight is one of my great favourites. The 9-weight for me has replaced the 10-weight. In one of my previous videos, which I will link up here, where I've gone to odd line weight rods, the 9-weight has become my all-round saltwater fly rod. With the backbone and power that you have with a 9-weight in modern rods these days, especially the one I use, which is the Hardy Zephyrus, which I absolutely adore, that 9-weight, there is very few fish that it's not capable of tackling. I mean, once you get into GT territory, probably not, but it's certainly handled fish up to 50 pounds, big bumphead parrotfish. It's a perfect permit rod because, again, you've got that agility and you've got the precision, but at the same time, you've got a nice lightweight presentation. So the 9-weight for me, the 9-foot 9-weight has become a really good all-rounder. In the freshwater scenario, the 9-weight or the 9-weight class has come into being on two-handers especially. In the old days when we were using 15-foot 11 weights and 14.5-foot 10 weights, the 9-weight has really surpassed all of those. So the 13.5-foot, the 13-footers, all of those line classes, 9-weight's ideal for that, especially if you're going to be using sink tip systems or you're going to start using head systems, because the 9-weight's got the guts to deal with heavy sunk tips. A 10-weight in my scenario really is mostly saltwater. I use a 10-weight for tarpon fishing in the Caribbean. If you want to go for larger permit, it makes an ideal heavy permit rod. If you're going to start throwing around some much larger size 2 crabs and things like that, it's a really good rod to use for that. But particularly for tarpon, it's absolutely ideal. If you're going to be fishing for residential tarpon or snooking amongst the mangroves, and you are casting quite a lot, you don't want to be using heavier line classes, the 10-weight's an absolutely ideal weapon for this. It's a pretty lightweight, but it's got an awful lot of power. When you go into two-handed scenarios, the 10-weight is a much bigger river rod. You'd probably be using that on a 14.5 footer for rivers in Norway, perhaps in heavy water, early June conditions. You want to be using that on maybe the main stem skeiner if you're going to go for Pacific salmon and kings and things like that. So the 10-weight is a big, powerful weapon. Then we move into another of my real favorites, which is the 11-weight. The 11-weight has surpassed the 12-weight for me, so I've come down a line class. It's much easier to cast. We're talking 9 foot here for salt, and the 11-weight has become the go-to rod for many tarpon and giant trevally fishermen. It's got damn nearly as much backbone as a 12-weight, but at the same time, it's much easier to cast. You can throw nice big flies on it with no difficulty at all, but it's a pleasure to be casting with all day. So it's a really good all-round saltwater rod for bigger species. So the 12-weight used to be our main go-to tarpon and GT rod, and it still has its place in that. If you know that you're going to be fishing for migratory tarpon in the Florida Keys, or you're going to be fishing for big tarpon in Nicaragua, then you need a 12-weight. You need that lifting power to be able to subdue those fish as quickly as possible. The other situation I particularly like to use a 12-weight is if I know that I'm going to be giant trevally fishing along a reef edge, and I know that I need every single ounce of power and aggression that I can get, because then that 12-weight comes into its own, because you can lead into it as hard as you can, and you know that you are applying maximum pressure to the fish. So then we get into the really big line classes. You're getting into 13, 14, 15 and 16. Now these essentially are Billfish rods. They are designed for fishing off the back of big 35 footers and casting flies at fish we probably shouldn't be. So those fish which are like marlin or tuna, because actually 12 weights will handle most sailfish these days, but when you know that you are going to end up in a serious tussle and that actually you can't subdue that fish on the surface and it will turn into a sheer brute force tug of war, that's when you want these higher line classes of rods. Many of them these days are built with gimbals on the bottom, so you can attach them to a fighting belt, which will give you a much better chance of landing those bigger fish. And the 16 weight really is such a beast. It's not even something I really want to talk about. So I hope that gives you a nice little intro to all of the different varieties of rods which are in the fly fishing arsenal. Probably end up with a large quantity of those in your quiver, because it is very useful to have different rods for different jobs, and then you can explain to your other half that no, that rod won't do this, I have to go and get another one. It is one of those things which can be a little confusing, especially to those who are just getting into fly fishing as a whole. It is a little bit of a minefield, but if you are confused at all, just go and ask someone either in a tackle shop or one of us, who is going to give you an opinion onto exactly which rod length and line class you're going to need for which task. As always, I hope you found this video useful. Please like and subscribe to our YouTube channel, and I'll look forward to seeing you on the next one.